everyone, welcome to the Fuel the Fight podcast. I am Lieutenant Colonel Nick Behringer, and we have a guest I've been trying to get on a long time. I think since I started the show, one of the most brilliant scientists I know, and I'm lucky enough to call him a friend, Dr. M Margolis at the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine in the Military Nutrition Division. Lee, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Appreciate the invite. I don't know if you've been trying that long, but
I have in my head.
Certainly glad to be here.
In my head, man. I'm always about asking you. Lee, you're a well-accomplished scientist. I'm not going to go through all your stuff. I thought let's hear it straight from you. Could you give the listeners a bit about your background and what you do there at USARIEM?
Sure. So my research career started while I was a 65 Charlie. So I was a uniform dietitian, just like yourself. Back in 2008, I was stationed at USARIEM in the Military Nutrition Division. During that time, I just came out of the Army Baylor graduate program in nutrition. So it was a master level RD. I functioned as a research dietitian where I mainly did project coordination type roles. I did a few studies with the Special Operation Forces looking at energy needs during various training operations to try to understand how many calories they should be consuming during their different missions. You and I wrote a very nice review paper on all of that work to try to get a better understanding of a predictive equation for what different scenarios require different energy requirements, so service members are fueling appropriately. I was here for about 4.5 years as a uniform dietitian, and then once my time was up, I decided that I could be of most service to the service member by going back to school and getting my PhD. So I used my GI Bill and went to Tufts University, where I studied under Roger Fielding in the Nutrition, Exercise, Physiology and Sarcopenia Laboratory. I picked up a lot of new biological molecular techniques looking at metabolism at the whole body and skeletal muscle level. And I brought those back to USARIEM, where I have run a research program for the past 8 years looking at how exercise, diet manipulation, or environmental exposure affects carbohydrate metabolism, and potentially our recommendations for how soldiers should be fueling during different training scenarios to either optimize or enhance their physical performance.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, you've just been at this for the time frame when you say 8 years. A lot of research has happened in that time. You've done projects, I know, at altitude. You've deployed as a Army soldier to Afghanistan and research Marines. You've Norway special operators or Norwegian soldiers as well?
Norwegian soldiers, yeah, conscript soldiers there.
Yeah. So just a bio. You've kind of been there and done it all when it comes to researching the warfighter.
Yeah, all said and done, I've been at USARIEM for 15 years now, as either in uniform, out of uniform, technical staff, manager, now principal investigator. So, I have a unique perspective in the field of research here, where I've been able to not only be here so long, but also see it from all different sides.
Yeah, I've done a lot of great research, and we would have to do multiple episodes to cover all your great research. But today I want to talk about one we've been chatting about because I see it pop up a lot, particularly in the special operations community: ketones, right? Ketone, well, even in the civilian sector, you get them on your feed on Instagram and all that, talking about ketones. So first things first, when we look at ketones, right?
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what is a ketone? And then the salt versus the ester, the two main forms we see in the kind of commercial environment.
Yep. So a ketone endogenously produced, so that means that it's being made within our body, is a downstream metabolite of fatty acid oxidation. So as your body is breaking down fat for fuel, it is making this byproduct that's called ketones. Now, ketones in and of themselves can be used for fuel, and they're beta hydroxybutyrate or acetoacetate. that can be transported out of the liver where they're primarily produced by ketolytic enzymes, and they can go into circulation, and then they can be taken up by peripheral tissue to contribute to the Krebs cycle for energy production. Ketones historically are associated with fasting. So when your body is very starved of energy and of glucose, it produces these ketone bodies that can be used for fuel. They can cross the blood-brain barrier, and they could actually help fuel your brain. If you restrict your carbohydrate intake to a severe extent and increase the amount of fat that you're consuming, you can make these ketone byproducts, you can make these ketone metabolites, and you can use them for energy for daily living. When people think about these ketogenic diets, they are very restrictive diets that for many people, they can be very difficult to follow because you are essentially eliminating one of the three main macronutrients that we are consuming as humans. So carbohydrate intake gets reduced to about 5% of your total caloric intake for a day, less than 50 grams per day, which is very hard to do. Some people like these type of restriction diets because it's easier for them to follow because they know they just don't eat carbs, and that's simple for them to follow, but being able to maintain that for a long time can be difficult. There are scientists that think that there are beneficial properties in and of themselves of beta-hydroxybutyrate. In this case, we're just going to be talking about performance. Ketone bodies do other things. They're outside of my lane, so I just want to clarify that I'm only going to be discussing physical performance here today. That to get around trying to consume these restrictive diets, you can consume an exogenous sort of ketones as a ketone supplement. These supplements are very effective in increasing beta-hydroxybutyrate concentration, which is the main ketone that they're part of these supplements, to enter your circulation and put you into an acute ketosis. You mentioned salts and esters. Ketone supplements do come in different forms. The salt or the ester is referring to the carrier that the beta-hydroxybutyrate is associated with. The carrier that the supplement comes in does seem to dictate how potent the supplement is. So studies that have compared just the increase in beta-hydroxybutyrate blood concentrations when somebody consumes a salt versus an ester supplement have shown that the ketone ester supplement is more effective in putting you into ketosis and raising your ketone bodies to a greater extent than the ketone salt.
Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. And I should have clarified when we back that is like we're not talking about, because this gets confused with other people.
Yeah.
The ketosis with the diet, doing it via the diet. We're going to focus on supplementation.
Yeah, so it's very important to recognize that a ketogenic diet and a ketone supplement are going to result in completely divergent metabolic responses. So when we think about a ketogenic diet, the way that I look at it is your body is earning those ketones, that your body has to go through an adaptation period where it is no longer relying on carbohydrate for fuel as much, and it needs to switch over to be burning fat to a greater extent than it was before you were on a ketogenic diet. And as you are breaking down that fat, your body is making these ketones, which it is then going to allow to enter circulation again from the liver and to be used for either fuel or the other various jobs that ketones have. When you consume a ketone supplement, your body doesn't need to work for that because you're just consuming it from an exogenous source that is going to result in a very rapid and transient increase in circulating ketone bodies. Because you are because you are increasing the concentrations of beta-hydroxybutyrate to such a rapid rate, without your body needing to break down fat for it, it actually results in something called end product inhibition. So what that means is that you think about the ketone is that's the end of the line. So everything is leading up to your body needing to make more ketones when you're on a ketogenic diet. If you just raise the amount of ketones that you already have in circulation, you're stopping the train. Your body understands it doesn't need to make more ketone bodies because it already has such a large presence in circulation. So what happens is that ketone supplements end up being anti-lipolytic, meaning that it's telling your body, hey, you don't need to break down as much fat as we were before because we have the final product in such a large quantity already.
I hope people are taking notes on that. That's very, very important to note. So if anybody were to try to compare and say, you know, I've got this ketone supplement, I am trying to sell you this, and they're quoting research that was done with the ketogenic diet, that's just false and misleading.
Yeah, they're very different metabolic pathways in what they're doing.
Right. So you mentioned a little bit about like the end product and stopping that train. With
Yeah.
that being said, what about ketone and how does it impact performance? Because I see a lot of advertisements and even other groups talking about, okay, if I can give an athlete extra substrate of these ketones and they can take carbohydrates and they can take these other, substances, I can improve performance. What have you seen with your research?
Yeah, so the hype behind ketone supplements, particularly the ketone ester, which I think that'll be the supplement that we're going to talk the most about because
Right.
that does seem to be where kind of the commercial products are leading where the research is going, because it has that greater efficiency in increasing beta hydroxybutyrate. The hype really started back in 2016 in a cell metabolism paper that was first author was Peter Cox. What these investigators did was that they had a series of experiments where they were showing the ability for these ketone supplements to cause ketosis. They had experiments where they were showing the changes in other substrate metabolites associated with carbohydrate and fat metabolism, showing how the ketone supplements were affecting the metabolism of those various pathways. And then the biggest thing that they showed was that during a 30-minute time trial in cyclist, there was a 2% improvement in distance travel during those 30 minutes when the participants consumed a ketone plus carbohydrate supplement leading into that performance test compared to a carbohydrate supplement alone. So the ability for the ketone supplement to improve aerobic performance in this case during that investigation really just kind of blew the lid off of people being excited about ketone supplements for performance enhancement. Those studies, when you look at them, they were well controlled and well conducted. I don't have, anything negative to say about that work. The results that they got seem to be accurate to the study, the design that they, put forth with the participant. The thing with the field, though, is that in any field in science and, ergogenic aids is data needs to be reproducible. So to actually prove or show that something is going to be a performance enhancer, subsequent work needs to be done to show the same thing. And looking at the field of ketone supplements, the data really seems to be equivocal, meaning that most of the results that you're going to see in the literature are going to be null, meaning that nothing happened, that there was no positive or negative effect of taking the ketone supplement, looking at the totality of the research. So the fact that subsequent studies weren't able to reproduce the same results as that initial study question the actual ability for these ketone supplements to act as an ergogenic aid and enhance performance.
No, thank you for that. So, we had one study in 2016 that showed some promise that it could, be an ergogenic aid. Now that it hasn't really shown any definitive results that it is an ergogenic aid, can we talk about the other side of the coin that you have shown, I believe, in some of your research and then others, that it could even be an ergolytic, that it could negatively impact performance?
Yep. So one of the arguments that people would make when we talked about ketone supplements, and the military specifically was interested in potentially incorporating them in some training, or potentially even as ration products down the road, was that, a lot of the research that was being conducted wasn't really specific to, military type activities, which is a fair and valid comment to make. So what our laboratory did was that we conducted experiments where we looked at the impact of ketone ester supplement plus carbohydrate versus carbohydrate alone on substrate metabolism during 90 minutes of load carriage exercise. So participants in this study consumed one of the supplements before exercise. They then walked on a treadmill for 90 minutes, wearing a weighted vest that was 30% of their body mass. And then we took blood samples and we took breath samples so we could actually measure what was going on with carbohydrate and fat metabolism during the bout of exercise. They then had a 7-day washout period, and they came back and we repeated those experiments where they consumed the other supplement. Along with the steady state exercise that we did, we also measured physical performance. So 30 minutes after they completed the load carriage exercise, we had them do a time to exhaustion run. So they ran on a treadmill without load carriage at 85% of their maximal aerobic capacity. To do our due diligence, we had them come back the next day and consume the supplement before doing a 4-mile time trial where they wore the load carriage again. So they wore that weighted vest, and they completed a 4-mile ruck as quickly as they could. Again, either consuming a ketone plus carbohydrate supplement versus a carbohydrate supplement alone. I was pretty surprised by the results that we found. I kind of thought that we would see no real effect on physical performance, but we would have some changes in substrate metabolism. What we saw from the metabolism standpoint is that overall, the rate of glucose turnover, so your body's ability to release glucose into circulation and then take it up by muscle to use for fuel, overall that was lower when the participants had the ketone supplement plus carb versus carb alone. That seemed to be primarily driven by the ketone inhibiting glycogenolysis within the liver. So it was diminishing the amount of glycogen that was being broken down in the liver that could then be released as glucose into circulation to be taken up and used for fuel. And similar results have been seen in other studies that have done ketone infusions under resting conditions. So overall overall glucose turnover was lower with the ketone supplement. The efficiency in which glucose was taken up by muscle was no different between the two treatments. So we do this other measurement that's called metabolic clearance rate. And this takes into account any differences in circulating glucose concentration, which when we gave the ketone supplement, circulating glucose was lower, which is a pretty normal finding across the literature of ketones. So the ability for the muscle to take up and use the carbohydrate was not any different between the two supplements. We also measured plasma oxidation, so that's the taking up and using that glucose for fuel. There wasn't any difference between the two supplements there. And we measured exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. So the amount of carbohydrate that we gave as the supplement that was used for fuel during that exercise bout. And again, we didn't see any differences between the ketone plus carb versus carb supplement in that experiment. We did some metabolomics research where that's where you can measure, hundreds to 1,000 metabolites that look at all different types of pathways to see how your body is using different nutrients under different scenarios. What we saw was, again, not a huge change in any of our metabolites that are related to glucose metabolism, but a rather large change in metabolites that are related to fatty acid mobilization and oxidation, which mirrored that kind of anti-lipolytic effect that you would expect to see with a ketone supplement in reducing mobilization and potentially the oxidation of circulating free fatty acids. Looking at our performance data, pretty surprisingly, we saw that there was a decrease in time trial performance. So the ability for the service member to complete the 4-mile ruck took longer when they consumed the ketone plus carbohydrate supplement versus the carbohydrate supplement alone. Similarly, the time to exhaustion, so their ability to run at 85% of their aerobic capacity, their maximal effort, was shorter when they had the ketone supplement plus carb versus the carb alone. So overall, we saw no real change in glucose metabolism when the participants consumed the ketone supplements, and we saw a reduction in physical performance in this study. So that goes to that the ergolytic effects that you were discussing.
Yeah, and for the warfighter, hopefully folks are paying attention because they really need to take note of this. Is, if you got to get to a fight and I got to ruck, I'm going to now, ruck slower, which can affect something. And then you drop that ruck and you're doing actions on the objective or whatever, and you might have to run repeatedly time. It could also prevent you or cause you to fatigue more quickly and slow down. So that's some real world tactical application that shows that the ketones are not only going to, they don't really have a potential to benefit the warfighter for performance, but they could actually impede the warfighter the performance when it matters the most. So I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you because you're the expert. Should warfighters be taking ketones?
So with the current state of the literature, my recommendation would be no. And it's not just that we saw a negative effect in our study, because every study is going to have, strengths and limitations, and somebody could do some of the measurements that we did a little differently in their study and get some different results than we did. But if you look at the totality of the research field, so taking all of the published work that has been done on ketone supplements, at best, you are going to show a null effect. So the ketone supplement having no real positive or negative effect on physical performance. Given the price point at which these supplements are being sold, and the transient effect that they're going to have on ketosis, I would say the cost-benefit ratio isn't there to recommend the use of these as an acute ergogenic aid. And when you're comparing it to something like a carbohydrate supplement, which is relatively cheap, and most studies are going to use as their control, because that's kind of the gold standard right now, is a carbohydrate supplement, that the cost-benefit ratio of a carbohydrate versus a ketone supplement is going to be much higher in the carb supplement versus the ketone supplement.
No, we didn't really hit on that because I looked at the cost and I forgot how much I don't know if you know it off the top of your head, but it'll definitely be ergolytic to your wallet. if you use ketones. Supplementation, I mean, they're very expensive. What per ounce? Is it per ounce, or do you have any
Off the
idea?
top of my head, I don't know. But if you're comparing a ketone supplement to a standard carbohydrate supplement, there is a wide margin of difference in those. And just looking at the research, the carbohydrate supplement, as long as you're taking an appropriate amount at an appropriate concentration, it's not going to cause an ergolytic effect.
Right.
And if you're using it appropriately with your training and then with your competition, carbohydrate is the gold standard of sports nutrition performance aids.
There you go. I like it. So bananas over ketones. No. Well, Haley, one of the things though, some folks might say they're seeing now in the research is though that ketones can improve erythropoietin, right, or increase erythropoietin in the body, which might help you perform better. What do you say to that?
Yep. So, for the audience, erythropoietin, it's a hormone that is naturally produced in your body, and what its main job is for red blood cell production. So if you have more EPO, and if you can produce more red blood cells are very important for carrying oxygen from your lungs to your muscle. And the more oxygen you can carry, hypothetically, the greater your aerobic capacity is, and the better you're going to be able to perform. So yeah, there has been a couple of very recent studies that have come out, one acute and one after, I believe it was 21 days of overtraining, that showed when you consumed a ketone supplement during recovery from exercise, which is different than our study. We did it before and during, but consuming a ketone supplement during recovery, there's going to be enhancements in erythropoietin concentrations compared to, I believe it was carbohydrate or it was a non-nutritive placebo in the studies. I apologize, I don't remember quite off the top of my head. But what the investigators are alluding to is that, well, if you're taking these supplements and then during the recovery phase you have a higher EPO concentration, perhaps over time with training and taking these, you can actually improve the oxygen carrying capacity. One study was looking at improving the capillary density of muscle, so the actual amount of blood that's getting to the muscle, where it can be dropping off nutrients, oxygen for sustaining performance, is potentially enhanced with the ketone supplement. These are, interesting results. It's important to note that, as far as I'm aware, there's 2 studies looking at this with ketone supplements so far. One of them was acute, so it was just with a single bout of aerobic exercise and then in the recovery phase. And because it's acute, for EPO to actually increase red blood cells, it takes time. It takes weeks. It's not going to happen in a single bout of exercise. So everything those investigators did on that study was appropriate, but it's a very short time frame. So they're not able to say if this increase in EPO is actually going to result in increased red blood cell production, so increase hemoglobin, hematocrit, and if that's going to result in improvements in physical performance. We're going to go back to our study. We have some archived plasma samples, so I'm interested to see if we have a similar result with the EPO concentrations in our study that these investigators did in theirs. But again, our study is acute, so it's going to be very limited in what information we can glean from that. The other study that was a more sustained training study, the results are interesting. There are, however, some limitations to the design of the study. The biggest thing is that the investigators didn't control what the participants were eating during the study. Doing controlled feeding studies are very hard and time consuming. So a lot of investigators will give participants recommendations on the types of foods and the amounts of foods they should consume, and then they use 24-hour or 3-day food recalls so they can actually measure the energy and macronutrients that their participants were consuming, so they can see if that's a confounding variable that might be affecting their results. Unfortunately, in this study, the participants on the ketone supplement during the training increased the amount of food that they were consuming compared to their baseline levels. So with the training, they ate more energy, they ate more carbohydrate, they ate more protein, which could impact the results in that study. So it's not, I can't definitively say that it did, but it is a confounding variable that needs to be taken into consideration when looking at these literature. Certainly, more work needs to be done where we have these repeated exercise bouts with the ketone supplements to actually see any impact on EPO and if that's actually going to affect hemoglobin hematocrit. But right now, there isn't enough evidence to say definitively, yes, EPO is going to go up and this is going to result in improvements in red blood cell count and then thus physical performance.
Yeah, thank you for that and clarifying that. And when we talk about EPO, you know a thing or two about EPO because you just relatively recently, right, finished up some studies utilizing EPO, looking at the potential to use it with warfighters. Could you talk a little bit about that research?
Yeah, so actually about 2 months ago, we just finished that study.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, based off of some work from your old boss, my current boss, Dr. James McClung, he very clearly showed that the ability for a warfighter, their oxygen carrying capacity is incredibly important to their ability to do their job, to perform at their peak level. During basic training, we've seen that there are reductions in hemoglobin hematocrit. So there's the stress of the environment might be causing some negative effects that you don't want to see during training. So there's increases in inflammation, which are going to increase concentration in this protein called hepcidin. Hepcidin is a regulator of iron, and it will actually block the release of iron into circulation, which is then going to impede your body's ability to use that iron for hemoglobin to carry oxygen from your lungs to your muscles to perform. So what we were interested in seeing is, well, if we give a low dose of exogenous EPO as a subcutaneous, so right below the fat injection during 4 weeks of a very high physical training period, is that EPO going to be able to kind of combat some of the negative effects that we've seen during some of our more intense training operations to essentially negate the reductions in hemoglobin hematocrit and at least optimize, so maintain physical performance or perhaps enhance it. So this was a 4-week study where we controlled dietary intake. So we fed them every day during the study, and we controlled their exercise. The first 2 weeks, they burned 1,200 calories for 4 days, doing various aerobic exercise training, so either running on a treadmill, cycling, or rocking. On the 5th day of every week, we had them do a 5 kilometers, 3.1 mile run on a treadmill, so we could track how physical performance was changing over the 4 weeks that they were receiving the exogenous EPO. Every week, we also did a safety blood draw where we measured their hemoglobin hematocrit so we can track how that was going to make sure that their hematocrit wasn't getting too high. That is one potential side effect with exogenous EPO is if you take too much of it, your hematocrit gets too high, your blood essentially becomes too viscous, which is not good for you. We saw no negative effects like that with our study. And it was interesting. So over this 4-week period, from baseline to week 1, we saw a little dip in hemoglobin hematocrit, and we saw that their time trial performance got a little bit slower. But then as the EPO was able to start working, which generally is going to take about 2 weeks of the half-life of the EPO to kick in, we saw a nice decline in the time that it took for them to complete the 5-kilometer run. So they were able to run faster. And we saw increases in hemoglobin and hematocrit throughout those last 3 weeks. And really a lot of the benefit was able to be seen within 2 weeks of using it. So it seemed like there was a 2-week window in which you could actually see an ergogenic effect with the drug.
Nice. So 2 weeks, and can you say how much faster they were able to get, or roughly?
Yeah, so I think it was about 3 minutes that their time to
Wow.
completion improved. Yeah, so they were very drastic improvements. And with this, we also did some more of our substrate metabolism measurements. So I was interested to see, some secondary effects of EPO, of not only what's going on with the oxygen carrying capacity of it, but also, how does this change how your body's using carbohydrate and fat? Interestingly, it didn't seem like it had too much of an effect on the amount of carbohydrate that was being oxidized during exercise, but it did increase the mobilization oxidation of fatty acids. So what we did for this study was so they did the steady state load carriage exercise like we did for our ketone study. Again, for this one, 90 minutes, 30% of your body mass they were carrying. And we had to match the relative intensity of the exercise batch. So because the EPO was able to improve their oxygen carrying capacity, their VO2 max, so their aerobic capacity improved by the end of that 4-week period. So what we had to do was make the load carriage exercise from an absolute standpoint harder. So they walked at a faster speed at a higher incline to make the relative intensity of that exercise the same that it was at the beginning, because they had those positive effects with the EPO. So what happened was that because the absolute exercise bout gets harder, the total amount of energy that's expended during that exercise increases. With that increase, we saw that there was no change in the amount of carbohydrate that was being oxidized, but all that extra energy was coming from fat oxidation. So they were able to use their endogenous fat stores for fuel at a greater extent than they were at the beginning of the trial. So those were some interesting results. We've also did some muscle biopsies in those studies. So we're looking now to see what type of changes we might have seen with the muscle fiber type, and then also with the capillary density of our muscle fibers as well, to see, is it a shift in, type 1, type 2 type situation where you have more mitochondria that's allowing for this increased fat oxidation, or is it that the capillary density of the muscle is actually greater, so you have greater oxygen delivery, which allows for the greater fat oxidation?
Wow, I mean that's really exciting with the fat oxidation, because I'm sure you're thinking the same thing. Can maybe see a scenario, especially with the large scale combat operations where soldiers aren't able to get as much food as they'd like, and if you could cause a shift where they're oxidizing more of their fat they have on board, and not see those decrements in performance we see, that's very exciting. What about altitude?
Yeah, so we have a line of altitude research. There might be a lot to get into now, but
okay. We can save it for another show if we want to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, our institute does have quite a bit of altitude research. We do. Roy Salgado, who's an investigator in the Thermal Mountain Medicine Division, is actually currently conducting a study where he's looking at the use of exogenous EPO leading into high altitude exposure at Pikes Peak and Colorado Springs, and looking at the effectiveness of EPO in that scenario. Hopefully he'll finish data collection for that study this year. So results on that TBD. We do have a line of research that looks at how high altitude exposure affects exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. We've seen that even though carbohydrates the primary recommended macronutrient when going to high altitude, because it doesn't need oxygen to be burned as a fuel, your efficiency to burn carbohydrate is reduced compared to at sea level from a dietary source. So during a bout of aerobic exercise, we see a 30 to 50% reduction in the rate of exogenous carbohydrate oxidation under high altitude, acute high altitude, compared to sea level. So we did some additional analysis and looking at circulating glucose, insulin, and then also glucose turnover. A lot of the changes in metabolism seem to somewhat marry somebody with an insulin insensitivity. So it's almost like they're developing diabetes under these acute high altitude conditions. So we currently have an investigation going on now that we've had a few participants complete to this point, where we have them conducting exercise while consuming carbohydrate under high altitude conditions using our hypobaric hypoxic chamber here at USARIEM, and using an oral diabetes drug, pioglitazone, to see what type of benefit or lack thereof that might have on the rate of exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, to hopefully reduce the amount of stored carbohydrate glycogen being used for fuel during that exercise bout, which will ultimately result in an improvement in physical performance if it is sparing those endogenous sources.
No, a lot of exciting information there, in terms of we're taking away carbohydrates, king. EPO, we're not telling people to go out and use EPO, but for specific situations for warfighters, there could be some potential benefit there. At least you've shown at sea level to be determined at altitude. At
Yep.
altitude, carbohydrate utilization is impeded. And so if there's a way or mechanism, or even if that's a pharmaceutical agent, to increase the ability to use carbohydrate at altitude, could also be a benefit for the warfighter. Lee, thanks so much. I mean, this is a lot of information. I know folks will enjoy it. Is there any kind of closing thoughts or anything you'd like to tell the folks about, your work or you as we close out?
Closing thoughts. Well,
So I know it's the worst. I know I set you up for that, man.
appreciate it. The biggest thing for people to just remember is that no one study is ever going to be definitive. That if you're looking at supplements, at performance enhancers, look at all of the research as a whole, not just one study, because there's always going to be multiple factors to consider before investing your time and your capital into these type of things.
Nice. So don't fall for all the slick marketing. That's how I'll sum it up for that. Hey, Lee, always a pleasure to chat with you. I tell you, I was taking notes. I'm always learning something when I talk to you. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick. I appreciate it.
All right. Hey, that's all we got. Like, subscribe, and tell us if you enjoy this episode.